What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 15 disgusting foods people really ate in 18th century America. What did people eat in the colonies? You may be surprised by the answer. Though popular imagination remembers colonial America for its quaint tea, ginger cakes, and pudding, the tastes of early Americans were actually far more exotic and fascinating than they may first appear. Colonial-era food was complex, resourceful, and, in some ways, worldly, as early Americans inherited the tastes and recipes of the British culinary tradition, while putting their own spin on it. Just like foods from around the world that you may not want to try, food in colonial America might also seem over-the-top, unappetizing, or even gross to modern tastes. Many foods that colonists loved are no longer made today for a variety of reasons. However, some foods have managed to survive. Though colonial Americans proclaimed in 1776 that all men are created equal, all food dishes, it seems, are not. Crazy colonial food recipes thus provide an interesting and entertaining window into one of the most important facets of life in the colonial era: what people ate. The story of food in colonial America isn't just about what was on the supper table. It is also a story of class, taste, culture, and empire, just like any period's culinary profile, such as the Great Depression. Beaver tail, some delicious gamey-tasting fat. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Great Lakes region hosted a booming fur trade due to the large population of beavers in North America. It should come as no surprise, then, that beaver meat was also consumed. In colonial America, beaver tail was a unique and delicious delicacy. The meat was very fatty and typically roasted, and it has been described by at least one contemporary cookbook writer as essentially gamey-tasting fat. Chocolate and ambergris, a sinful delight do whales vomit. One of history's most stomach-churning food additives is known as ambergris, and in essence, it's expensive whale spit up, and men and women in the 18th century loved to add it to their food for a decadent treat. Adding ambergris to chocolate was a European import. The recipe was first developed in Europe in the 17th century and spread. Pretty soon, cooks in colonial North America were flavoring their chocolate with ambergris, too, thanks in no small part to the growing whaling industry in New England. Today, ambergris is used as an ingredient in lots of expensive perfumes, thanks to its musky odor and attractant properties. And you can still get in fancy hot chocolates some places if the urge ever strikes. Calf's foot jelly, a special treat you could get just from boiling a hoof. Molded gelatins and jellies were all the rage on both sides of the Atlantic in the 18th century. Particularly, calf's foot jelly was a well-known dish. And it's exactly what it sounds like: a gelatin that emerges while boiling the hoof of a calf. Early Americans believed calf's foot jelly was even good for the sick. Oyster ice cream, Dolly Madison's dessert of choice. By the second half of the 18th century, ice cream was becoming a beloved, if decadent, dessert. However, despite the fact that many notable early Americans did so, it was difficult to prepare and store ice cream without modern freezers. It just took a massive ice house and a large enough staff to keep large chunks of frozen water around to maintain it. Ice cream was a well-known favorite of the Washingtons and Thomas Jefferson. Some people like to try different flavors of ice cream. Ice cream with oyster flavor, which is said to have been a favorite of Dolly Madison, is one such flavor. She would churn up the small, sweet ones from the nearby Potomac River into a unique after-dinner sweet. Eel pie, so prized colonists would use lobsters in eel traps. Colonial Americans were wild about eel. It was especially consumed in New England, where colonists would use lobster as bait in eel traps. My, how the tables have turned. Though eel can be eaten any number of ways, eel pie was a popular way of cooking up the sea creature. One recipe for eel pie even goes back to the 17th century. Pepper cake, a treat you could keep in the pantry for half a year. Colonial Americans may have had some of the same ingredients we use today, but that doesn't mean they used them like we do. Take, for instance, Martha Washington's recipe for pepper cake from her book A Book of Cookery. Pepper, a newly acquired spice from India that could be used to show off a hostess's fancy-schmancy social status, went into the cake alongside sweet ingredients like molasses. And here's the kicker: These little babies could, and were meant to, last for a quarter or half a year. Like many in the 18th century, Martha Washington liked to put pepper into things we might not think to add it to, especially sweet, dessert-like concoctions. The beloved transatlantic dish of sewed swan colonial men and women enjoyed a wide variety of specialty meats that have since fallen off the American menu. Take the swan, for example. Today, eating what many consider to be the graceful, elegant swan would probably create an outrage. But colonial Americans didn't think that way. Stewed swan was one of many dishes that colonists actually copied from England. Applejack, hard apple cider on steroids. Fun fact: North American apples are not native. Settlers from England actually brought the tree with them, and apples quickly became a dependable, multi-purpose food staple for colonists. Perhaps the most interesting apple incarnation was Applejack, which was basically a hard apple cider on steroids. Colonists created Applejack by freezing hard cider. The process of freeze distillation would jack up the alcohol content of the beverage. Though colonists consumed quite a bit of alcohol, and drinking Applejack was like downing many glasses of alcohol at once. Applejack was roughly 30% alcohol. Anchovies, mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, and English ketchup, the ketchup we know and love today, bears virtually no resemblance to the ketchup that colonial Americans enjoyed in the 18th century. Their ketchup wasn't even tomato-based. In fact, it was an Asian-inspired sauce made from a mixture of ingredients, like mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, and anchovies. One recipe for ketchup from Colonial Williamsburg calls for an equally bizarre combination of vinegar, white wine, cloves, ginger, anchovies, horseradish, and nutmeg. The savory sauce was then eaten with fish or meat by colonial Americans. Lobster, a dish that is best enjoyed by the poor, slaves, and inmates. Even though some foods haven't changed much over the centuries, their meanings and associations have changed a lot. The majority of modern Americans associate lobster with extravagant dining. Not so for early Americans. The British North American colonies clung to the Atlantic seaboard, making seafood common. There was no more common food, in all senses of the word, than the then lowly lobster. In point of fact, the vulgar lower classes of colonial America were associated with lobster as a meal. Lobsters were so cheap, in fact, that they were used to feed slaves and prisoners. Clabber, curdled milk with a little pepper on top. Clabber was actually less disgusting than its name might suggest. It was simply a form of yogurt made from soured curdled milk. In an era before refrigeration, so it was also pretty strong and sour. People would typically add toppings like cinnamon, nutmeg, or pepper to flavor the clabber. Clabber, like many American foods, was brought to the Appalachian backcountry by Scotch-Irish immigrants in the 18th century. Turtle soup, a wealthy household staple. The turtle was unquestionably one of the most popular foods in the 18th century. Virtually every wealthy household had a tried and true recipe for turtle soup. Though turtle soup was consumed on both sides of the Atlantic, the imperial trade meant that wealthy families in Britain and France got access to turtles from the colonies. It was especially prevalent in Virginia and Maryland, where there were plenty of turtles. Cooked with wine and butter, turtle soup was considered a rich, decadent dish. Pigeon, a delicacy prepared with the greatest care and flair. They are now referred to as sky rats. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, many wealthy colonial Americans looked to pigeons as their dinner. For the upper classes who could afford elaborate meals, pigeons were a delicacy that should be prepared with the greatest care and flair. For those who could not afford expensive spices, simple pigeon pies were also consumed. Posset, a drinkable curdled custard. Posset was a rich, creamy 18th century dessert. Made with cream, eggs, and flour, posset at first sounds like a delicious custard. The problem? Add some ale, and it becomes drinkable custard, as the ale curdled the cream. In colonial days, posset was a popular drink to serve at weddings and was sometimes served in specialty pots. Scrapple, pork scraps and cornmeal formed into a loaf. Scrapple is what it sounds like from its name. Scrapple was primarily found in the Pennsylvania Dutch country and other parts of the mid-Atlantic colonies. It was made by cooking pork scraps in cornmeal to make a loaf. Usually, scrapple used parts of meat that would otherwise go to waste, like the heart and liver. Some Amish and Mennonite communities continue to eat scrapple today. When people imagine 18th century American cuisine, they often picture something charmingly rustic. Hearty stews simmering in iron kettles, cornmeal biscuits slathered in molasses, or ladies sipping spiced tea beside a hearth. However, if you look beyond the nostalgia and into the actual recipes and eating habits of early Americans, you will discover that their tastes may have been surprisingly odd, boldly unrefined, and downright disgusting in comparison to the standards that are held by modern people. These were people who didn't have refrigeration, limited access to seasoning, and a cultural legacy inherited from England, a place where boiled eels and kidney puddings weren't just accepted, but celebrated. In fact, early American food was not only utilitarian but frequently stomach-turning. The colonists' diet reflected not just the necessity of survival in a harsh land but a willingness, if not an enthusiasm, for consuming whatever was available, however revolting it might seem now. Food was a matter of class, religion, availability, and preservation. In spite of all of that, the colonial kitchen served some truly bizarre dishes, such as fatty beaver tails roasted like marshmallows and chocolate flavored with ambergris, which is, in fact, whale feces. That only scratches the surface. One of the more unsettling treats was calf's foot jelly, made by boiling the hoof of a young cow until the gelatin released, forming a bizarrely jiggling pudding thought to restore health. Then there was oyster ice cream, a particularly unsettling juxtaposition of seafood and dairy favored by none other than Dolly Madison. It was made by whipping oysters with sugar and cream before freezing into a disgusting mush that was served as a dessert. Eel pie was another shocking favorite, especially in New England, where colonists used lobster as bait to trap eels. An ironic reversal given that lobsters were once considered garbage food suitable only for prisoners and slaves. A gelatinous monstrosity would be created by stuffing these eels into a flaky crust and baking them. Pepper cake, a recipe from Martha Washington herself, sounded benign until you realized it involved stuffing molasses cake full of black pepper and leaving it in a pantry for 6 months, aging like some culinary Frankenstein's monster. The stewed swan followed next. That's right. Majestic, graceful swans were routinely captured and stewed into a tough, greasy meal that colonists copied directly from their English ancestors. On the boozier side of things, colonists invented a brutal drink called applejack by freeze-distilling hard cider into a 30% ABV punch to the liver. Meanwhile, those who preferred sauces were slathering meat in English ketchup, a nauseating slurry of mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, anchovies, and vinegar that had nothing to do with the tomato-based condiment we know today. But if you were poor, you might not get to enjoy these lavish horrors. Instead, you'd likely be fed clabber, which was curdled milk left out until it achieved a pungent sourness, then sprinkled with pepper or nutmeg and slurped down. And for those with refined palates, butter, cream, and colonial pomp made turtle soup a popular dish. Wealthy Virginians consumed turtle meat with aristocratic pride, while pigeon pie offered another upscale delicacy, though the modern image of pigeons as dirty city birds makes it hard to stomach the idea of them once being treated like foie gras. Posset, a drinkable custard curdled by ale, offered yet another confusing mix of textures and temperatures, often served in ornate vessels to celebrate weddings and births. Last but certainly not least was scrapple, a loaf of mashed pork offal and cornmeal that was sliced and fried into breakfast slabs. It was a frugal invention, made from hearts, livers, and anything else a butcher would throw out. And yet it lives on today in parts of Pennsylvania. All of these dishes give us a taste of 18th century life that's rarely mentioned in textbooks. Gritty, practical, indulgent, and oftentimes utterly grotesque. The colonists' world was one where necessity met strange luxury, where no part of the animal was wasted, and where something like whale vomit could be considered haute cuisine. So while they may have written about liberty and virtue by candlelight, they also dined on eels, slurped rotten milk, and served prisoners what we now call seafood delicacies. Welcome to the revolting and fascinating early American dinner table. When we imagine colonial American cuisine, we often think of simple, hearty meals, stews, bread, roasted meats, and pies. However, the reality was far more peculiar and sometimes revolting than modern palates might expect. From beaver tails and chocolate with a whale vomit flavor to eel pies and curdled milk custard, Colonial Americans ate a wide variety of foods that today's diners would find disgusting. In the 18th century, food was shaped by necessity, limited preservation techniques, and European culinary traditions that frequently included bizarre or downright disgusting ingredients. Some dishes were delicacies reserved for the wealthy, while others were survival foods for the poor. Either way, many of these foods have, thankfully, disappeared from modern menus. In 18th century America, some of the most revolting foods were actually eaten, and their bizarre histories are included here. 1. Beaver tail, a gamey, fatty delicacy. Before beavers were hunted nearly to extinction for their fur, they were also a food source. Native Americans had long consumed beaver meat, and European settlers adopted the practice. What is prized most? The tail. One 18th century cookbook described the fatty gelatinous dish made from roasted or boiled beaver tails as essentially gamey-tasting fat. The skin was sometimes crisped like pork rinds, while the inner flesh turned soft and oily. Why did they consume it? High fat content made it valuable in cold climates. Easy to preserve by smoking or salting. Considered a frontier survival food. Today, beaver tail is mostly a historical curiosity. However, at reenactments, some adventurous eaters still try it. 2. Chocolate mixed with ambergris, whale vomit. One of the most revolting luxury ingredients in history is ambergris, a waxy substance expelled from sperm whales' digestive systems. When aged, it develops a musky, sweet scent, making it a prized and expensive flavoring in 18th century Europe and America. Ambergris was sometimes added to hot chocolate to give it a rich, exotic flavor because of European trends. Recipes from the era describe grating small amounts into chocolate drinks for a unique taste. Why did they consume it? Regarded as a digestive aid and aphrodisiac. Symbol of wealth, only the rich could afford it. Believed to enhance the flavor of chocolate. Ambergris is used primarily in perfumes rather than food today, and for good reason. 3. Calf's foot jelly, a gelatin made from boiled hooves. Before box jello, gelatin was made the hard way, by boiling animal bones, cartilage, and hooves for hours. One popular version was calf's foot jelly, a wobbly, savory sweet dish made by simmering calves' feet until the collagen turned into gelatin. Colonial cooks flavored it with wine, sugar, or spices and served it as fancy molded dessert. A health food for invalids, believed to strengthen the sick. A side dish at wealthy tables. While it might sound similar to modern bone broth, the texture and appearance were far less appealing. 4. Oyster ice cream. Dolly Madison's favorite dessert. Ice cream was a rare and luxurious treat in the 18th century, requiring ice houses and labor-intensive churning. However, some colonial Americans took it to bizarre new heights, such as making oyster ice cream. It was said that First Lady Dolly Madison liked this unusual dessert, which was made by freezing raw oysters with sweetened cream. The briny, creamy combination was supposedly a hit among Chesapeake elites. Why did people eat it? In coastal areas, oysters were abundant and inexpensive. Sweet and salty flavors were fashionable. A means of displaying wealth, ice cream was a sign of status. Today, it survives only as a historical oddity, though a few adventurous chefs have tried reviving it. 5. Eel pie, a colonial comfort food. Before lobster became a luxury, eels were a staple protein in colonial America. They were so prized that New Englanders used lobsters as bait in eel traps. Eel pie was a common dish, made by layering chunks of eel with spices, butter, and sometimes hard-boiled eggs in a pastry crust. One 17th century recipe describes it as, take your eels, cut them in pieces, season with nutmeg and salt, lay them in a pie with butter, and bake them. Why did people eat it? Eels were easy to catch in rivers and estuaries. High fat content made them filling. Could be preserved by smoking or salting. Today, eel pie is mostly forgotten, except in a few traditional British pubs. 6. Pepper cake. A hard, spicy dessert. Modern gingerbread is sweet and soft, but colonial peppercakes were dense, spicy, and could last for months. Martha Washington's personal recipe included molasses for sweetness, black pepper for heat, aged dough to develop flavor. These cakes were baked until hard as a rock, then stored for up to half a year before eating. Why did people eat it? Pepper was an expensive import, showing off wealth. Long shelf life made it ideal for travel, believed to aid digestion. Today, a few historical reenactments still make pepper cake, but most would find it way too spicy. 7. Stewed swan. A dish fit for royalty or pretentious colonists. Swans are now protected birds, but in the 18th century they were fair game, literally. In imitation of British aristocracy, wealthy colonists occasionally served stewed or roasted swan at banquets. The meat was described as dark and fatty like duck but tougher, often heavily spiced to mask the strong flavor. Reserved for special occasions. Why did people eat it? Symbol of wealth, swans were rare and regal. Showed off European aristocratic tastes. Alternative to goose or venison. Today, eating swan is illegal in most places, and most wouldn't want to try it anyway. 8. Applejack. Colonial America's strongest and most dangerous drink. Colonial Americans drank a lot of alcohol, partly because water was often unsafe. One of their strongest drinks was applejack, a freeze-distilled hard cider with 30% alcohol, like drinking vodka made from apples. How was it made? Ferment apple cider into hard cider. Leave outside in winter to freeze. Remove ice, water, leaving concentrated alcohol. Why did people drink it? Cheap and easy to make. Incredibly potent. Popular in rural areas. The downside. Poor distillation could lead to methanol poisoning, causing blindness or death. 9. English ketchup. A mushroom walnut anchovy slurry. Modern ketchup is tomato-based and sweet, but the original ketchup was a brown, fishy, fermented sauce made from mushrooms, for umami, walnuts, for bitterness, anchovies or oysters, for saltiness, vinegar and spices, to preserve it. It was used as a dipping sauce or glaze for meat by colonial cooks. Why did people eat it? Preserved well without refrigeration. Added strong flavor to bland foods. European influence, similar to Asian fish sauces. Today it's a culinary relic, though some chefs experiment with historic recipes.